Woo! Oh man, how could you stand to be near me?
I couldn't.
Oh dude, I am so sorry.
On the Lord of Nick. On the Lord of Nick. On the Ricky Low while living #1 Nickelodeon.
When I said that I was doing Mr. Meaty for this retrospective, a lot of people seem to have a problem with that on principle. After all, Mr. Meaty isn't exactly animated, at least not in the traditional sense. It's a puppet show, and a lot of people wonder, would you count a puppet show as a cartoon? Well, the answer is no. See you in the next review. I'm kidding. Puppetry is one of those things that's kinda on the border of what's considered animated or not. Different sources count Mr. Meaty differently. TV Tropes, for instance, counts the show as a Western animation, while Wikipedia considers Mr. Meaty as live action. However, I personally would not count puppetry as live action. The actual writing and humor of puppet shows tend to use the strengths of animation rather than live action, with odd-looking characters, fantastical scenarios, and quick-paced humor. Even if Mr. Meaty isn't technically a Nicktoon, it has a lot more in common with the Nicktoons than their live-action shows, like iCarly, or even Ned's Declassified. And let's be honest here, if I ignored Mr. Meaty for this retrospective, it's all that I would hear about for the next year or so. Are puppet shows animation? If you're watching this video, I don't think you care. Plenty of cartoons include puppetry or even have puppet characters, so that's close enough for me. I guess we can start off by talking about the puppets in the show. They are incredibly low quality and they tend to look off-putting. They barely resemble something you could call human, but quite honestly, I don't really mind that. It fits in with the Nickelodeon canon. Anything looks good after As Told by Ginger. All throughout the 90s, we dealt with people that had potato heads, or football heads, or worse. These puppets were originally made for a bunch of 2-minute shorts in 2002, which would often play during commercial breaks. They starred Parker and Josh in their daily adventures at the fast food establishment Mr. Meaty, their place of employment. The very first one of these was about Parker and one of the customers deep frying their own hands and eating them. Somehow, this got popular enough for them to commission an entire series, which lasted for 2 seasons and 4 years. The first actual Mr. Meaty episode came out in 2005, and the last one came out in 2009. So, altogether, that's about a grand total of like 8 years of Mr. Meaty. While this show was long-lived, I can't say that it was all that popular. At some point it was booted over to Nickelodeon's sister network, Nicktoons, which is another reason that gives me credence to review it as a Nicktoon, considering even Nickelodeon apparently considers this a Nicktoon. I'm gonna sound really crazy when I say this, but Mr. Meaty is overhated. Like, seriously overhated. I'm not gonna say the show is good or anything, because it's not good, but a lot of people like calling this show like the worst thing ever. Like, it has a legendary status as bad animation. You see so many lists of the most disturbing kid shows ever made putting Mr. Meaty on it, and it's just not disturbing. I mean, first of all, it's not a kid show. Mr. Meaty is clearly a show aimed at teenagers, and it's much more in line with something you'd find at Nick at Night than your typical Nickelodeon cartoon. But Mr. Meaty is actually not that gross or disturbing. Yes, the show that started with 2 characters basically deep frying and eating their hands. And yes, another episode featured the characters juggling a tapeworm in their stomachs. If this was like actually fully animated like 2D animation, I might actually agree with you that it's disturbing, but the fact that this is a puppet show actually goes a long way in its favor. If this was not a puppet show, I'd probably agree with a lot of the infamy of the show. The puppets look off-putting, but I do think that's kind of the point. Mr. Meaty exists in a rather off-putting world, and the way these things look helps sell the disturbing things that are happening in that world. It's not like the cute drawn SpongeBob randomly suffering from a gory pussy splinter in one episode. Everything in Mr. Meaty is consistent, and you're able to get used to its ugliness. And this might be just a me thing, but it's really hard to get grossed out by puppets. Even when things got quote-unquote frightening in the show, I was never disturbed by it. There's really only so much you can do with the expressions and mannerisms of a puppet to really sell the illusion of life. It creates some extra barriers that I really do think helps the show. What bothered me the most about this show was its humor. It's kind of like regular show if regular show was mellowed out on pot. Mr. Meaty is filled to the brim with stoner humor. Most of the time, things are incredibly slow until something incredibly random happens. We need to deal with an episode about someone trying to get rid of acne, and then at the end the character loses their nose. It's kind of like that. I'm gonna say what everyone else has said, but giving Mr. Meaty a full show was a mistake. Mr. Meaty, its formula, only really works as shorts. I can actually kinda dig its humor in short bursts. I know that sounds insane, but I did kinda like the shorts. I wouldn't go back to watch them too often, but it's not like an assault on my senses or anything. But when you have to extend those shorts to 11 minutes, problems start forming. And not helping is that the characters aren't very strong personalities. The show stars a cast of typical teenagers, and that's all of them are. Just generic teenagers without any real personalities. I can tell the differences between Josh and Parker, which is more than I could say for the breadwinners, but that isn't saying much. Parker is extremely gluttonous and a bit more stupid than Josh. And Josh is not extremely gluttonous and extremely stupid. Josh has no personality. As far as comedy goes, there's a different duo on Nickelodeon that has a Josh that you probably should be watching over this. Fans of Mr. Meaty, and yes, those do exist, would tell you that you're better sticking with the first season. The first season dealt at Mr. Meaty and this crazy pseudo-disturbing things that happened there. Season 2 took some risks and took the Mr. Meaty out of Mr. Meaty. Yeah, it was about the general lives of Josh and Parker, which was definitely a mistake. How do you not have Mr. Meaty in your Mr. Meaty cartoon? What is the point? Nah, it had them doing generic high school things, and even learning life lessons. Yes, the Tapeworm show started doing episodes about life lessons. It's kind of like a more brain-dead version of Doug. At one point, we see Parker use a chainsaw to get into Josh's house because he wasn't invited to Josh's party, which is cool, I guess. Honestly, I was expecting a lot more from the show, and I don't know whether to be grateful or disappointed. Like most people assumed it was, I expected this to be one of the most infamous, disturbing things. You know, one of those things that I'd remember years from now, like Mega Baby, or Adult Party Cartoon, or Mr. Pickles, or Where the Dead Go to Die. But no, Mr. Meaty is actually really tame. Like, I don't even remember, having to look away from the screen once, and I could keep watching episodes, which is more than I could say for even other Nicktoons. Would I recommend Mr. Meaty to anyone? I don't know. It's not disturbing enough for those type of viewers, but it isn't really entertaining enough for anyone else. It's largely a mishmash. I'm sure that someone somewhere would have gotten something out of it. It did have 2 seasons after all. Maybe if the show was a touch more pleasant with better looking puppets, it could have been a cult classic or something. As it stands though, it's just a minor strange curiosity that we speak of in terms of legends. I'm glad that I finally checked it out to at least know enough about it. If you want to see it though, good luck. Episodes of this show are hard to find unless you want to use illegitimate means. Nickelodeon isn't selling it anywhere, probably because they see it as one of their biggest mistakes ever. But if that's the case, I don't know why they're selling Breadwinners or Sanjay and Craig, cause no joke, I'd rather watch this than either of those. Oh, and I don't care what anyone else says. Mr. Meaty's theme song is awesome. It is one of the best constructed theme songs that I've ever heard. Not only does it sound great, but it sounds like it would be a really good jingle for an actual burger joint. It kind of makes you want to eat at Mr. Meaty. At least until you remember that you're more of a good burger person.
Next on Nickelodeon.
That's right! I'm in the house! Here it comes! Extra, read all about it. The best burgers in town from all around. People from around the world come and get it. The line goes around like a merry-go-round.